Right, welcome back. We did promise you another minister here on Morning Live, and this, of course, as we've been zooming in on the executive and talking to some of the newly appointed ministers in the Government of National Unity. So today, our guest in this segment is Minister Solomon Malatsi, who is the new Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies. Now, there's been a lot of speculation about what should be matters of urgency to be tackled and the priorities for this portfolio. Some of the expectations include the finalization of South Africa's spectrum policy, creating a strong telecoms regulator, and also bringing solutions to the crisis at the South African Post Office and addressing financial troubles at the SABC, among others. However, Minister Malatsi is here in studio this morning, and let's speak to him about his vision and, of course, also try and get some responses to questions that may arise. Minister, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you very much. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's first just take your pulse in terms of how it's been, and because this is one of those portfolios that people, it may not necessarily jump out at you, but it is so critical in terms of everything that has to happen in the country.
No, absolutely. I mean, as I was saying to you earlier offline, that it has felt like being in a high-speed car chase because every day you get a reminder of the magnitude of the responsibility that this department has. And the reality of the situation is, unlike the frontline service delivery portfolios, in a lot of people's imagination, it doesn't seem instrumental, but it is instrumental to a whole lot of interconnectivity across, government's ability, one, to provide services, but also to provide a regulatory environment, either be it for broadcasters, you were speaking briefly about, the finalization of the spectrum policy, and whether it's about, empowering South Africans with the infrastructure they need to remain connected to the world, because connectivity is an important issue in this climate that we are in, and also the general state of state-owned enterprises in this portfolio. Historically, a lot of them come from a very difficult past, and there's been some movement in terms of improvement in governance and how they are managed. And I think the biggest contributor in there has just been the lack of stability, even at executive level. I mean, we've had more than 13 ministers in this portfolio over a period of time, and that also contributes to just the general state of stability. And then you go across the board, even though in recent years there's been much more stability, is you need the state-owned enterprises like the Post Office, the Post Bank, the SABC, to be run well, and some of them have been run well, but also to be financially sustainable so that they can increasingly be less dependent on state funding, because the reality of the financial situation that government finds itself in is that there is less and less money to fund government activities and government programs. So it will be strategic even for the national fund for these entities, for us as government leaders, to create an environment that allows them to, one, diversify sources of revenue, so that they are financially independent and financially sustainable, so that you can then dedicate government funding towards the social services that are then needed to uplift the lives of the most vulnerable in society.
Minister, you speak of stability, which is, of course, critical. But just in terms, and I guess this is also an opportunity to give clarity on some of the matters that have come up in the newspapers and other media platforms of late. After your appointment, of course, as a member from the Democratic Alliance in this Government of National Unity, DA and its position, its view on an entity such as the SABC, for example, talking towards privatization and the like. So let's just give clarity in terms of policy certainty in this space.
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that, because it's key to have policy certainty in this environment. The reality is that, all of us that are allocated into these several portfolios, we are not necessarily there to advance the preferences of our parties, right? Secondly, the GNU will come with a common policy approach for governance that will then inform the priorities that roll over into respective departments in terms of what we pursue. In terms of, my party's policies, I think those are well known, but those are party preferences. It does not mean that automatically they become government policy. We still have to go to cabinet to lobby for policy preferences, and cabinet is where policy decision making gets done. So I don't want people to have fears that there is automatic, or change of policy, because that is not how the framework of the GNU in essence will work. The focus is, how do we as a department, for instance with shareholder in the SABC, create the environment to support the SABC, to make sure that the SABC is financially sustainable? What role do we play in that regard? Because it will be advantageous to the department to have the SABC depend less and less on government funding. So that is something that I'm vested in it, because the more I can, dedicate resources elsewhere, it's better. But also linked to that is a well-functioning SABC is to the well-being of South Africa generally. And I think one of the highlights of the road to the elections has been the extent to which the SABC did a good job in providing coverage of the elections, the depth it has in terms of reach. Therefore, my role is to make sure that for as long as I'm in here, I can ensure that to the extent that my powers allow me, we provide the resources that the SABC needs. We make sure that we can assist in creating a legislative environment that empowers the SABC to be able to pursue other avenues of revenue that can help it to compete in this space, because it is in a space that it is constantly evolving and it is highly competitive. But there is still scope to have a well-running and well-funded national broadcaster. We just need to make sure that it's less dependent on state funding.
And I'm curious about that, because with the public service mandate that the SABC has to deliver on, if you say less funding from state coffers, how then would that model look? Because the SABC, as it stands right now, I think only receives about 3% of funding, and the rest, is commercially obtained. But with that, there is that public service mandate which constrains the SABC to a very large degree. A department such as news, for example, in terms of what you can and cannot do, is limiting. So the funding model of the SABC is absolutely crucial, in addition to some of the other issues the SABC faces, like our bill to Centec, for example, is sitting at in excess of 700 million rand. The former minister, Mondli Gungubele, in response to a question, was saying that we pay Centec about 20 million rand per month. It's a lot of money that the SABC simply doesn't have. So that funding model is absolutely crucial.
Absolutely. And let me just correct something, because I don't want to create the impression that the approach is that we are reducing funding, right? The approach is that in order for the SABC to succeed, right, the size of funding it gets from government is never going to be enough. And I think the current, allocation of resources make that point obvious. Therefore, we're going to look for opportunities, be it from a regulatory perspective, be it from a legislative perspective, to say, how can we help empower the public broadcaster to be in such a state that it can attract other sources of revenue. You'll be glad to know that in the discussions that I've had with the SABC and the different entities, I met them for the first time earlier this week, there's already movement in terms of an arrangement of that Centec bill, and progress has been made to that regard. But I think there's also an opportunity over and above that to look at, what they call the quantum payments, so that they are not strenuous again to the health of the SABC.
So are you able to share with us, what that is? Because this is an albatross around the SABC's neck, and to the point that this matter has been taken to the Competition Tribunal. It's a serious, serious matter, and if one thinks about the fact that these are sister entities, the SABC and Centec, it makes very little sense, the way things are playing out right now.
No, absolutely. So one of the things that we're going to try to underscore going forward, because there are so many entities that belong to this department, and there's an intersection in terms of the regulatory environment, that we're going to try and resolve as many of the difficulties and disputes that we have in-house, and explore every avenue in-house. before we proceed to whether it be the competition commission or the tribunal or the courts, because I strongly believe that a lot of this can be resolved through mediation and negotiation. And the attitude from both entities is there to resolve it that way. So I was very encouraged with the discussion that we had with the SABC leadership earlier this week. And even from Santec, there's a recognition of that. You can't have entities that belong to the same department fighting each other over a dispute in another forum. You know, that should be the last resort, or it shouldn't even be a resort, because some of this, I believe, can be resolved.
So just before I move on to other matters that are also in your portfolio, do you believe that the public broadcaster is necessary in South Africa?
Well, the current law makes it clear that it is necessary, right? And for as long as the law is there, I think we have to respect the law. Our role is we have to work with what we have. And right now, the law makes provision for a public broadcaster to exist, and we have the responsibility to make sure that we support it in the way we are empowered to do for it to succeed. And this speculation, because I don't want this hanging over, you know, the future of the SABC. The current law is clear, and let's stick to what the current law says.
Does Minister Solly Malatsi believe that the public broadcaster is a necessity in this country?
I think individual preferences are irrelevant because they have to be grounded by the law. I'm guided by the law. I can't do things outside the prescripts of the law. So when you start talking about individual prescripts, they are meaningless if they are not guided by the law, because you will be asking me to get into a terrain that is not legal.
I think you know why I asked that.
Definitely.
But moving straight along.
And you know what? I appreciate that, because the reality is you are trying to reconcile all of these complexities with different parties' historical positions and preferences. So it is a fair question, but I'm equally saying that the GNU hasn't established a common set of policy priorities, and we are going to use the first forum of engagement in there to put those on the table and advance those inside. But for as long as they haven't been finalized in there, we're going to make our best efforts to make the current model work.
And I appreciate that, Minister. Moving on to the South African Post Office, you know, again, here's an entity that has been slowly dying before our eyes, and many, many problems. But it's been a few short weeks in office, but, you know, what have been your observations so far about the South African Post Office?
Well, the sense that I got from the briefing that was made to us from the Post Office, it's currently under business rescue. And there's some steadiness there in terms of the operations and trying to position it in a market that is equally to the challenges the SABC is facing, highly competitive, right? But the advantage that the Post Office has is that its infrastructure is spread across even the most remote areas in the country, right? And there is still scope, in my view, for the Post Office to succeed. But we gotta look at how, in this highly competitive market, do you create the space for government to still have some stake of ownership in it, but allow, you know, new ways that will help it to be competitive, to be able to provide the services that it needs by keeping up with the trends that are there in the postal and telecommunications sector, but also for it to be able to deliver. And that is where the opportunity is. So I'm excited about the opportunities that lie in there, because I think the team that is leading the business rescue there, you know, is doing a solid job, and will give them the chance to complete their work. But I think there is opportunity to relook at the model of ownership going forward. And it's something that, again, we'll be using the channels of the GNU to present, to say, you got to look at the financial sustainability of the Post Office and its reach, and those two are reconcilable. So how do we then create a model of ownership that will maintain those two, but provide a key service that many South Africans access on? I think for many individuals, whether you are from a township, from a village, there was always a nearby post office around in your neighborhood, and many of those have closed, you know, over the years, but they still have a massive footprint across the country, and we shouldn't neglect that, because it's a resource that I still believe there's an opportunity to resuscitate it and have it functional.
Especially from a cost perspective.
Absolutely.
For the majority of South Africans. We take it for granted, but 10 Rand for a pensioner is a lot if they have to pay that in services and not be able to withdraw that from their SASSA package.
And that's the unique advantage that it has, because ultimately any government should, one, make it less costly for residents and citizens to access its services. That speaks to the post office, that speaks to, access to even, government services online. So we must constantly look at opportunities to remove these barriers that take an extra cent or an extra rand from a South African for them to be able to access the services. And that's why I'm encouraged about the brief that I've received so far about where the post office is and what the projection of the future is.
And with that, of course, there's the issue of the post bank.
Yeah.
So we know in several State of the Nations now, preceding President Cyril Ramaphosa's presidency, there have been talks in the State of the Nation addresses about the establishment of a state-owned bank. And for the longest time, it was viewed that perhaps the Post Bank would be that entity that would move in that direction. Again, your thoughts on what's happening there? We've seen a lot of monies lost, possible corruption. What are your thoughts on what's happening in that space?
Yeah, look, I think the department has an opportunity, and there's been early signs of, sometimes these things take time with progress to particularly restoring good governance when there's been a history of collapse. Right, so there's been movements in there to restore it, and they've got a very solid CEO there, an acting CEO there, who's doing fantastic work in terms of just improving their operational efficiency, so that again, the end user, who becomes the South African public, mostly in this instance the poor, have a pleasurable experience when they encounter these services, and they've got the assurance that when you go to a post bank with your card, you're going to have a transaction. Right, that is the one thing that you want, because these individuals spend money to go to the nearest post bank to access their own money. So you can't have a situation wherein you have the elderly queuing for so long and then get disappointed that they can't get their money back. It's as simple as that. But you gotta put good governance measures in place, and you gotta put structures in place that allow the institution to be run well. And where there isn't, there has to be accountability, and that accountability must be swift. Government processes often take time, but I think the South African public is sick and tired of seeing accountability take so long, while the vulnerable live with the burden of not accessing what is rightfully theirs. So I think, and I don't want to be overly optimistic, but I'm saying that based on the state that is there is opportunity to get these entities functioning as they should. And our challenge is going to be on accelerating their performance to the level that is consistent, because you can't have glimpses of excellence here and there. It has to be consistent, because everyone's interaction with our state-owned enterprises must be consistent, and it must be at a level that is a source of pride.
And then, of course, for many young South Africans, all they want is to have access to data, which may seem superfluous, but it isn't, because we are living in an information age. Where access to data and access to information could make a huge difference in a person's life. So just in terms of the spectrum policy for one, but generally around issues of connectivity, again, your observations in the short time that you've been in office, and where do you think the should lie?
No, absolutely. I think, access to internet becomes an essential in this day and age that we are living in. There's been a lot of good work that has been done through the SA Connect program, which aims to, enhance access to connectivity, connecting government buildings, public spaces with free Wi-Fi spot, and digitizing government services. My interest is we have to make sure that once there is access, that access is dependable, right? Because the costs already are a burden to many South Africans, even though there's been headway made in some instances in terms of the reduction of data cost. But once you have access, it has to be dependable, because you can't be connected and then it's constantly buffering, and you go to other government services, you can't access those. And make sure that every government facility, to the extent that we can, traditional authorities, schools, that they are connected, because what that does is it accelerates the process of consumption of news, access to information, and those things are empowering because there's a whole digital economy that also exists. And once we've empowered individuals with access, you can then take it to the next level and say, which opportunities in the digital economy do we leverage so that we can create livelihoods for so many South Africans that need them?
And you spoke to the cost issue, and there has been improvement, but still
yeah.
you know, I was looking comparatively, we still among the highest.
Yeah.
You know, so that is an issue that still needs to be addressed.
Absolutely, there's no doubt about that, and we're going to be dedicating time and resources towards reducing the cost so that they are not a burden to the South Africans. Obviously, these things operate in a market, right? And you have to always counterbalance that. To balance that in the extent that, yes, there has to be space for commercial viability, but also the public interest is a matter that cannot be downplayed. It requires a lot of collaboration with the sector, and we'll be doing very proactive engagement with the ICT sector and every role player in it, because ultimately, when the costs are not an inhibitor to access, the benefit is to everyone, you know, even to the telecommunications companies that exist in this era. So it's something that we'll be robustly engaging on it.
And, you know, with regard to the regulator and the regulatory environment in this space, we talk about ICASA, and again, because you're so new in the portfolio, you know, I guess it's only fair to give you time to really become au fait with a lot of the issues that are going on there, which you may already be familiar with, but I guess it would only be fair. But as far as ICASA goes, I'm just quickly reminded of a conversation I had yesterday with the Comric CEO about the proliferation of SIM cards in the market, and recard SIM cards. And a lot of the listeners felt that ICASA perhaps is not on top of that particular situation. But there are others, of course. So just in terms of where you think your priority should be with ICASA.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with ICASA, we just got to make sure that it's fully resourced. It has a huge mandate in a sector that is highly regulated, that is also very litigious because of the conflicting interest in there. But you also want regulation to not be an inhibitor to unlocking opportunities. You want it to be there to be able to foster an environment that creates, you know, market competition, but that also does not put the state and citizens at risk. So the issue that you make, I think, you know, many South Africans get affected by that, right? And there is scope, and we'll be engaging further with ICASA on that to tighten the loose ends in that, so that we are not all at risk of, you know, people duplicating our numbers or having, you know, spurious characters duplicating our numbers for very unethical reasons, because that also speaks to the protection of personal information and privacy.
And I must say that was quite scary listening to Comric talking about those recard SIM cards and the fact that as we sit here, you and I might have SIM cards, recard in our names that we're not even aware of. But Minister Malatsi, thank you so much for visiting us this morning. Looking forward to further engagements as we move along and you in your portfolio.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was Minister Solly Malatsi, and we have the ministers here coming through, just speaking to them about what they envisage for their portfolios and, of course, what they're going to prioritize. We also have that as our question of the day, but thanks to Mr. Solly Malatsi, Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies.